Her voice splintered, breaking apart with each word. My father died when I was just a child. Mama remarried. She thought he'd take care of us. But when she passed, he drank. He beat me. And then he sold me, like a sack of beans at the trading post. The prairie stretched out like an ocean of dust and silence, so wide a man could ride for days and still feel small. On the Llano Estacado, the horizon swallowed everything: hope, memory, even God's voice if you stayed too long. The air shimmered with heat, the sun beating down like a blacksmith's hammer on iron. Jacob Miller rode through that furnace, his horse's hooves dragging little clouds of powder behind them. He was a tall man, shoulders bent by years of ranch work and grief, with lines carved deep into his face by wind, time, and loss. His beard was peppered gray, his eyes the color of worn leather. He was not a man who sought company. For years now, he had only talked to the animals on his ranch and to the grave of his wife. That was where he was headed on this day. A visit he had promised himself would be brief. Lay down the flowers he'd cut by the creek. Speak a few words to the woman who'd once been his reason to wake in the morning, then leave before the sun stole too much strength from him. 47 years old, and he carried himself like a man already twice that. When he dismounted, the leather saddle creaked, a lonely sound against the silence of the burial ground. He tied his mare to a scraggly mesquite and walked slow, his boots sinking into the pale dust. The graveyard was no more than a scattering of mounds and cedar crosses, some carved carefully, some only stones set upright by calloused hands. Each one carried a story, and each story had ended here, in the land's unforgiving silence. Jacob removed his hat, pressed it to his chest, and stood before a small cedar cross. "Morning, Ellie," he said softly, his voice no more than a breath of wind. "Brought you flowers again, yellow ones. You always favored the stubborn colors." He knelt, laid the blooms across the mound, and for a long while just stood there, feeling the heat seep into his bones. The land around him was so still that even the flies seemed to hold their breath. He thought of the days when his wife's laughter had filled the little ranch house, the way her hands had softened the rough edges of his life. The fever had taken her quick, left him with nothing but echoes. He had never remarried, never even tried. Some wounds don't close. Then something stirred. At first, he ignored it. Out here, the wind often tricked a man's senses, made rags look like rattlesnakes, shadows like coyotes. But when it came again, that faint shift of fabric, Jacob turned his head. 30 paces away, near a forgotten mound, lay a heap of rags. Sun-bleached, dust-caked, still. He narrowed his eyes, hand sliding toward the Winchester slung on his back. The rags twitched. Jacob froze. A sound followed, weak, brittle, like a reed snapping underfoot. He stepped closer, careful, each boot sinking into the brittle earth. He thought of coyotes chewing scraps, or some traveler's bedding discarded. But then the bundle moved, in a way no cloth should. He stopped within reach, rifle half lifted, and then he saw it. A face, pale, bruised, half hidden beneath the cloth. Eyes too large, sunken into hollows, a mouth cracked with thirst. She clutched the fabric around herself like a shield, but her arms were thin as sticks, her skin blotched with dirt and blood. She looked at him without focus, as though seeing him from another world. Her lips parted. The words dragged out like rusted hinges. "I'm not clean anymore." Jacob's chest tightened. He knew what those words meant. Not dirt, not sweat, something deeper, crueler. A verdict stamped on her soul by the kind of men he had seen too often, men who took and broke and laughed about it after. He had lost a wife to sickness, but this girl had lost herself to something worse, to the hands of the living. He lowered the rifle and dropped to one knee. His voice was calm, the way a man speaks to a frightened colt. "Name's Jacob Miller. Ain't here to harm you." Her eyes blinked slow. She clutched the cloth tighter, trembling. Jacob uncorked his canteen, set it where she could see. "Water," he said simply. For a long moment she didn't move. Then, with fingers shaking, she reached. She drank, small gulps that rattled through her, coughing as though each swallow scraped her raw. Jacob watched, steady, saying nothing until she lowered it again. He saw now the rope burns on her wrists, the bruises darkening her neck. He set his coat around her shoulders. She flinched, then drew it close, inhaling as though even the smell of leather and smoke was a comfort. "What's your name?" Jacob asked. "Eliza," she whispered. He nodded. "Eliza, you picked a cruel place to rest." She turned her eyes to the graves. "They left me with the dead, said I belonged here." The words cut him. He studied the ground, jaw tightening. Then, gently, "How'd you come to be out here?" Her voice cracked, breaking into pieces as she tried to hold them. "My father died when I was small. Mama remarried. Thought he'd take care of us. But when she passed, he drank, and he beat me. Then he sold me, like a sack of beans." Jacob's hands curled into fists, his knuckles white. "I ran," she continued, her eyes drifting. "Two men caught me. They used me, then left me here, wrapped in a sheet. Said the coyotes would do the rest." Silence pressed heavy between them. Jacob breathed slow, his heart heavy as a stone. He had seen cruelty, but hearing it here beside the graves made his blood burn. Finally he spoke. "Eliza, I can take you to my ranch. There's shelter, food, and no man to lay hands on you without your say. Only touch will be to carry you. That's my word." She searched his face as if reading scripture, hunting for a lie. All she found was a weathered man, weary of loss. Her voice trembled. "I'm not clean." Jacob leaned closer, his words as steady as the earth beneath them. "You're alive. That's clean enough." A sound escaped her, half sob, half laugh. When he slid his arms under her, she didn't resist. She was light, fragile as kindling, but she clung to his coat like a child to a blanket. Jacob lifted her onto his horse, then swung up behind, wrapping the reins. Before he turned, he looked once more at his wife's grave. He imagined her stern eyes, imagined what she would think of him leaving a girl to die in dust because she believed she had no worth. He didn't need her voice to know the answer. As the horse started forward, Eliza whispered, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Jacob murmured. They moved slow, dust rising in soft clouds. But Jacob's neck prickled. He turned his head back to the graves. At the far edge, by a lone cedar tree, the sun caught metal, just for a heartbeat. A glint, then gone. He narrowed his eyes. Someone had been watching. He said nothing to Eliza, only guided the mare into the washes, where shadows lay longer, but he knew it in his gut. This was only the beginning. The ride home was long, though Jacob kept the mare steady and slow, mindful of the girl swaying in front of him. The plains stretched endless, golden dust spilling like an ocean, caught in sunlight. Out here, silence was its own kind of company, one Jacob had grown used to, but today It pressed heavier than usual. Each time the horse's hooves struck the hard pan, he found himself listening, straining for the echo of other riders. Eliza leaned against his chest, her weight so light he could barely feel it except for the tremor of her breath. She clutched his coat around her body, as though the leather might protect her from every hand that had tried to break her. For miles, neither of them spoke. Jacob let her have that silence. He knew sometimes words did more harm than the wound itself. By the time the outline of his ranch rose against the horizon, low timber walls, a small corral, the roof weathered but holding, Jacob felt a pang that startled him. For years, the ranch had been nothing but work and solitude, the echo of his wife haunting every doorway. Now he wondered how it would feel to bring someone back again, even if only a broken stranger. He slid off the saddle, lifted Eliza down with careful strength, and carried her across the porch. The door creaked open on hinges stiff with disuse. The air inside was cooler, touched with the smell of old wood and ashes long cold. He hesitated at the threshold of one room, the room that had once been Ellie's. The bed was still made, quilt folded neat, though dust had settled over the months. His throat tightened, but Eliza had nowhere else. He laid her on the bed, drawing the quilt over her. She clutched at the edge like a lifeline. For a long while, Jacob simply stood there in the doorway, hat in his hands, staring. He felt torn between past and present, between loyalty to a ghost and duty to the living. But the sight of her bruised face, her small body curled beneath his wife's quilt, broke something in him. Whatever struggle he had inside, it would have to wait. He stoked the stove, filled a pot with water, and set it to boil. His hands, rough and scarred from years of ranch work, moved with surprising gentleness as he cleaned her wounds. She winced when the cloth touched her skin, but did not cry out. That grit, Jacob respected it. He had seen men with less spirit fold in a heartbeat. "You'll heal," he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet but sure, like the steady ring of a blacksmith's hammer. Eliza's eyes flicked up to him, uncertain. Why are you doing this?" Jacob paused. The question was simple, but the answer was not. He thought of his wife, thought of all the graves scattered across the prairie. Then he said, "Because someone should have done it sooner." She looked at him for a long moment, then closed her eyes, too weary to argue. That night, Jacob sat by the hearth while the girl slept. The firelight painted his face in shadow and flame. He carved at a scrap of wood with his pocket knife, a habit he had picked up in lonely hours. His ears caught every sound, the whistle of wind at the eaves, the creak of the porch boards, even the shallow rhythm of her breathing in the next room. He thought of the words she had spoken in the graveyard. "I'm not clean anymore." They echoed inside him like a hymn twisted wrong. He had heard soldiers say similar things after war, men who came back half themselves, but on a girl barely 23, it clawed at him. When he finally allowed himself sleep, he kept the rifle propped within arm's reach. Morning came with the smell of dust and sun on the boards. Jacob rose early, as he always did, and set about tending the animals. Chickens stirred restlessly, clucking as though warning of things unseen. He brushed the horse, poured water at the trough, scattered feed. His movements were steady, practiced, but his mind drifted back toward the ranch house where Eliza slept. When he returned, he found her awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, his coat still wrapped around her. The quilt had slipped to the floor, forgotten. She looked small against the wide timbers of the room, but there was a stubborn spark in her eyes that hadn't been there the day before. He handed her a bowl of broth, steam rising in the cool morning air. She took it, her hands trembling, and sipped. "Thank you," she whispered. Jacob nodded, leaning against the doorframe. "Got plenty more. You eat, you rest. World can wait." She stared into the bowl, then whispered, "I don't know how to rest anymore." Something in the way she said it hollowed him. He wanted to tell her that here, at least, she could. But he had lived too long on this land not to know better. Peace never stayed. Outlaws, fever, drought, the West always tested what you thought you owned. Still, he said, "Try. Rest is the only thing that puts the fight back in a body." Her eyes lifted to his. For the first time, they held a question instead of defeat. Over the next day, Jacob watched her regain fragments of strength. She ate what little she could, drank water when he coaxed her to. She sat by the window wrapped in his coat, staring at the wide sky, as though trying to remember it belonged to her too. Each time Jacob passed, her gaze followed him, not mistrustful anymore, but searching. He noticed, too, how the house seemed to breathe again. For years it had been nothing but silence and the creak of timber. Now, there was another presence, fragile though it was, filling the space. In some ways, it unsettled him. In others, it eased something he hadn't known was clenched. That evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Eliza spoke again. Her voice was stronger than before, though still thin. "My real father. He was kind. I remember his hands, big and warm. He died before I even knew what it meant to need him. After that, Mama tried. She did. But she trusted the wrong man. And when she was gone, he showed his true face. I thought maybe if I stayed quiet, he'd leave me be. But he didn't." Her eyes glistened, catching the last light of day. Jacob sat across from her, silent, letting her words fall. He had learned long ago not to dam up another's grief. Eliza's voice broke again. "By the time those men left me in that graveyard, I believed them. I believed I was nothing but dirt." Jacob leaned forward, his hands clasped. His voice was steady, heavy with conviction. "Listen to me. Dirt don't breathe. Dirt don't fight. You're here. That makes you more than they ever were." She stared at him, searching for the trick, but found none. For the first time, she let her shoulders ease. That night, Jacob sat watch again, but something gnawed at him. The plains were too still. The silence felt like a stage waiting for actors to step out. He remembered the glint he'd seen near the cedar tree by the graves. Men who left a girl to die didn't often forget. Wounded pride always returned. Mina the second time. He loaded cartridges into his Winchester, each click sharp in the firelight. Eliza, half asleep under the quilt, watched him through heavy eyes. She clutched his coat tighter, as though even in her dreams she feared losing it. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest scent of horses. Jacob's jaw tightened. Trouble had a way of finding its way back. And though the house was warmer now, filled with more than one heartbeat, he knew the storm was already moving across the plains. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, fragile as glass. Jacob worked the ranch, mending fence posts, feeding stock, hauling water from the well, while Eliza watched from the porch, wrapped in his coat. Sometimes she helped, though her body was still weak. She fed the chickens, swept the wooden floor, or stirred the pot on the stove while Jacob chopped firewood. It was a small thing, but for her it was proof that she could still exist in a world that wasn't just pain. Yet beneath that surface, Jacob felt the land's unease. Chickens scattered at shadows that weren't there. The dog growled low at the wind. At night, the horses shifted restlessly in the corral. Out here, animals knew long before men did. Trouble was drawing near. One afternoon, Jacob carried a bucket from the well when the sound reached him. A faint thrum, steady as a heartbeat. Hooves, far off, but moving fast. He froze, the water sloshing against the bucket. His eyes lifted to the horizon. Dust rose like a wound, torn into the earth. He set the bucket down, slow. The Winchester leaned by the door, where it always waited. Eliza was inside, watching through the window, her wide eyes catching his own. She had heard it too. Her hands clutched the coat tighter around herself, as if the leather could shield her from the past, galloping back to claim her. The riders came into view. 2 men, pushing their horses hard across the dry field. Dust boiled behind them. Jacob recognized the one in front instantly. The scar along his jaw, the sling binding his wounded arm. The man from the graveyard. Behind him rode another, larger, meaner, a rifle slung across his saddle. Jacob's jaw locked. He stepped inside, speaking low. "Stay back, no matter what. You hear?" Eliza nodded, though her face was pale. She moved behind the table, her fingers brushing the revolver Jacob had left there. Jacob picked up the Winchester, loaded cartridges with steady movements. Panic never saved a man. He knew that well. Calm did. He stepped onto the porch, his boots thudding the wood. The riders pulled up at the corral, their horses snorting, dust curling around them like smoke. The wounded man called out, his voice sharp with fury. "Miller, you got something belongs to us. Send her out, and maybe we'll let you live to see another sunrise." Jacob rested the rifle in his hands, eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat. His voice carried, low and cold. "The only thing you'll take from this place is lead." A silence fell, heavy as iron. Even the wind seemed to stop. Then gunfire shattered the air. Bullets tore into the porch posts. Glass shattered behind Jacob as Eliza ducked low. Jacob dropped to one knee, returned fire sharp and precise. His first shot caught the smaller outlaw's horse in the leg. The animal screamed, collapsing in a fury of dust. The rider rolled free, cursing and fired wild. Jacob shifted, chambered another round. The second shot clipped the man's thigh, spinning him into the dirt. He howled, clutching the wound. The larger outlaw swung off his horse, bellowing, and raised his rifle. He fired toward the house. One round ripped through Jacob's shoulder, the force slamming him back against the porch rail. Pain seared white-hot down his arm, but his grip didn't falter. He ground his teeth, pushed back to his knee, and fired again. Inside, Eliza's breath came fast, ragged. She could hear the crack of each shot, the splinters raining from the wood, the curse of dying men. Her hands shook as she reached for the revolver on the table. She had never held a gun with the intent to kill, but rage began to eclipse fear. Through the doorway, she saw the larger outlaw charging forward, rifle blazing. Jacob staggered, his shirt dark with blood. Without thinking, Eliza raised the revolver, bracing both hands against the doorframe. The gun felt heavy, foreign, but she squeezed the trigger. The shot exploded, deafening. The outlaw jerked back, eyes wide, before crashing into the dust. The silence that followed was thicker than the smoke drifting across the yard. Eliza stood frozen, revolver trembling in her hands. The coat Jacob had given her flapped in the hot wind. Her chest heaved, her eyes wide. For the first time since the graveyard, she did not look like prey. She looked like someone who had just reclaimed part of herself. The wounded outlaw, still clutching his leg, stared at her in disbelief. His grin was gone. He scrambled to his feet, stumbling toward his horse, blood streaking the dirt. He spat toward Jacob. "This ain't over, old man. You hear me? Ain't over." He hauled himself onto his horse, kicked it hard, and vanished into the horizon, leaving a trail of dust and blood behind. Jacob lowered his rifle, breathing hard, pain burning through his shoulder. He leaned against the porch rail, sweat and blood mixing down his shirt. His eyes, though, never left Eliza. She still stood in the doorway, revolver in hand, trembling. The weight of what she'd done, what she'd had to do, settled on her like a storm cloud. Jacob's voice rasped, steady despite the blood. "It's over. For now." Eliza dropped the revolver. It clattered against the wood. She stumbled toward Jacob, falling to her knees beside him. Her hands pressed against his wound, shaking. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaking her face. "All I ever bring is trouble." Jacob caught her eyes, his own calm even as the pain gnawed. "No, trouble ain't who you are. Surviving is." She stared at him, searching for truth, and for the first time she seemed to believe. That evening, the ranch lay quiet again, except for the groans of Jacob's injury and the ragged rhythm of Eliza's breath. The smoke of gunpowder lingered over the yard. One man lay still in the dirt, his eyes staring lifeless at the sky. The other was gone, but not for good. Eliza sat by Jacob as he stitched his shoulder with trembling hands. She held the needle steady when his grip faltered, wiping the blood with strips of cloth. Each time he winced, she whispered apologies, though he told her none were needed. When the wound was bound, Jacob leaned back, pale but unbroken. Eliza sat close, the coat still around her, the revolver resting beside her on the floor. The firelight flickered across her face, no longer just a victim's mask, but something harder, more resolved. Jacob knew then what the plains always demanded. Peace would never last. Men like that outlaw didn't forget. He would come back, and when he did, he wouldn't be alone. But for tonight, they had survived, and survival, in this land, was its own kind of victory. The days after the gunfight dragged heavy with silence. Jacob's shoulder throbbed with every movement, but he refused to lie idle. He stitched the wound as best he could, kept it clean, and forced himself to do the daily chores. Eliza hovered nearby, helping where she could, feeding the chickens, hauling buckets of water with trembling arms, sweeping the porch where bloodstains still lingered. She moved like someone learning how to live again, each small act an act of defiance against the past that had tried to erase her. But Jacob knew better than to mistake quiet for safety. The West had a way of keeping score. Every evening, he'd stand at the porch, Winchester leaning on his good shoulder, scanning the horizon. He told Eliza little, but she could see it in the way his jaw set tight, the way his eyes narrowed at distant dust clouds. Trouble was circling. It was only a matter of time. It came on the fourth day. Afternoon sun burned low, painting the plains with long shadows. Eliza was mending a torn sleeve at the table when the dog erupted in sharp, frantic barking. The chickens scattered, wings beating in panic. Jacob was outside, hauling hay, when the sound reached him, the unmistakable thunder of many hooves. He dropped the pitchfork, eyes cutting to the horizon. Dust rose in a thick wall. Not 2 riders this time. More. "Eliza!" he shouted, striding fast toward the house. "Inside, now." She froze at the doorway, needles slipping from her fingers, eyes wide. She had heard it too. That low roar growing louder, like a storm of iron sweeping across the land. Jacob grabbed his rifle, shoved cartridges into the chamber with quick, practiced motions. His face was stone, but inside he felt the old cold settle in, the calm before a fight, the kind a man only learns after too many. Eliza clutched his coat tighter around herself. "It's them, isn't it?" His eyes met hers, hard and steady. "And more besides. They've brought company." The riders appeared like a dark wave, cresting the field. 6 at least, maybe more, faces hard, rifles gleaming. At their head rode the outlaw Jacob had wounded, his arm still bound in a dirty sling, eyes burning with hate. They pulled up at the edge of the corral, horses stamping, dust curling around them. The wounded man spat into the dirt, then called out, voice jagged with rage. "Miller, you took what was mine. You killed my brother. You're gonna pay in blood." Jacob stood on the porch, rifle in hand, shoulders squared despite the bandaged wound. "The only thing I took was a girl left to die." "The only thing you'll take from me is lead." The outlaw sneered, turning to the men around him. "Burn the place. Drag him out." The first shots rang out. Bullets tore into the porch posts, sending splinters flying. Eliza ducked behind the doorframe, heart hammering, ears ringing with the crack of rifles. Jacob returned fire, his aim sharp, even one-armed. The first outlaw to rush the corral dropped hard, a hole clean through his chest. But there were too many. They fanned out, surrounding the ranch. Gunfire ripped into the walls, shattering glass, tearing holes through timber. Smoke and dust filled the air. Jacob reloaded, fired again, ducked as bullets screamed overhead. His shoulder burned, every shot a blaze of pain, but he refused to fall. Inside, Eliza pressed her hands to her ears, then forced them down. Fear clawed at her, but something else burned hotter. She grabbed the revolver from the table, checked the chamber the way Jacob had shown her. Her hands shook, but her eyes were steady. Jacob glanced back, saw her crouched by the window. "Stay low," he barked. She nodded once, but her jaw was set. The outlaws closed in, whooping and cursing, firing wild into the house. Jacob's shots cracked back, each one measured. He dropped another rider, then another, but the wave didn't stop. One outlaw broke for the barn, torch in hand. Eliza saw him through the window. Before fear could root her, she raised the revolver, braced her hands, and fired. The man spun, torch falling, flames sputtering in the dirt. She stared at the smoking pistol in her hands, chest heaving. Jacob's voice called from outside, ragged but strong. "Good shot." But there was no time to breathe. The wounded outlaw himself stormed forward, face twisted with hate, shouting for blood. His men followed, firing into the porch. Jacob dropped to one knee, returned fire. But a bullet slammed into the railing inches from his head. Splinters cut his cheek. He ducked back, reloading, when the door behind him flew open. Eliza stood there, revolver in hand, eyes blazing. "I won't hide," she said, voice shaking but fierce. Jacob looked at her, sweat and blood streaking his face, and for a heartbeat he saw his wife's fire in her, different but alive. He gave a short nod. "Then stay close." The fight turned desperate. Outlaws circled, firing, shouting threats. One tried to flank through the barn. Jacob dropped him with a clean shot. Another reached the porch, kicking in the door. Eliza fired point blank, the blast echoing through the house, sending him sprawling lifeless into the yard. The air stank of gunpowder and smoke. The ranch house shook with each impact of bullets. Jacob's shoulder bled through the bandages, but he fought like a man with nothing left to lose. The wounded outlaw finally charged the porch, revolver blazing. Jacob's Winchester roared back. The outlaw staggered, but didn't fall, driven by hate more than blood. He bellowed, lunging forward, and Eliza stepped out from the doorway, revolver raised, her coat whipping in the wind. Her shot rang true. The outlaw's eyes widened, body jerking before he collapsed in the dirt, dust rising around him like a shroud. His revolver slipped from his hand, landing useless beside him. The other riders, seeing their leader fall, pulled back. Some cursed, some spat, but one by one they wheeled their horses and fled into the horizon, dust swallowing them whole. Silence fell. Jacob leaned against the porch post, chest heaving, blood running down his arm. Eliza stood beside him, revolver lowering slowly, her eyes wide and unblinking. The yard was littered with bodies, the smell of death and smoke heavy in the air. The dog barked once, then fell silent. Jacob let the rifle drop to his side. He looked at Eliza, at the way she stood tall despite the trembling in her hands, the way the coat flapped around her like a banner. "You did good," he said, voice hoarse. She turned to him, tears cutting paths through the dust on her face. "I was so scared." He nodded, steady. "Fear don't matter. What you did matters. You stood." She swallowed hard, eyes shining with something she hadn't felt in years. Worth. For the first time, she believed the graveyard had not been the end of her story. The ranch lay quiet when the last gunshot faded, silence settling heavier than the smoke that drifted low across the yard. Bodies sprawled where they had fallen, the dirt stained dark in places where blood had soaked deep. The air carried the acrid tang of powder, the faint smell of singed wood, and something else, the stillness of a storm finally passing. Jacob leaned against the porch post, one hand pressed to his shoulder, the Winchester loose in his other. He could feel the blood sticky under his shirt, the pain pulsing like a drum, but his eyes never left Eliza. She stood in the doorway, revolver still in her grip, though the fight had left her trembling. The coat he had given her flapped in the wind, too big for her small frame, yet somehow fitting. The dust caught in her hair, her cheeks streaked with tears and soot, but in her eyes there was no longer only fear. There was something harder now, something alive. Jacob exhaled slow. "It's over," he said. His voice was a rasp of smoke and gravel. Then, after a pause, "For now." The revolver slipped from her hands, clattering onto the porch. She stumbled forward, knees hitting the wood beside him. Her hands pressed against his wound, frantic, though she shook too much to be steady. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I only ever bring trouble. Everywhere I go, people get hurt." Jacob caught her eyes, his own calm and steady despite the pain. "Eliza, trouble ain't who you are. Surviving is." Her breath caught. She searched his face, as though she'd never heard anything like it. And maybe she hadn't. They worked through the night, binding wounds, dragging bodies out beyond the corral, burying them shallow beneath the hard-pan earth. Jacob moved like a man carved from iron, though his injury slowed him. Eliza worked beside him, hands raw, muscles trembling, but she refused to stop. Every shovelful of dirt, every ragged breath was her way of saying she was no longer a thing left for dead. By dawn, the yard was still again. The sun rose slow, painting the sky with bands of crimson and gold. Smoke still curled from the bullet-pocked porch, but the house still stood. And so did they. Jacob sank onto the porch steps, body aching, breath ragged. Eliza lowered herself beside him, hair tangled, face streaked with grime. For a long while, they said nothing. Just listened to the quiet, wind through the dry grass, the faint cluck of chickens that had survived the storm. Life, stubborn as ever, pushing forward. Finally, Eliza spoke. Her voice was soft but clear. I thought my life was over. Back in that graveyard, I was ready to believe it. But you gave me a reason not to. Jacob looked out at the horizon, the light catching in his weary eyes. Sometimes that's all a man, or a woman, needs. Just one reason. She hesitated, then whispered, There's more I need to tell you. Jacob turned to her, patient. Her hands twisted in the coat. Her eyes brimmed, but she forced the words out. I'm carrying a child, not yours. A shadow left by what they did to me. I thought if you knew, you'd send me away, like everyone else. Her voice broke. She braced herself for the disgust, the rejection she'd seen in other men's eyes. But Jacob only sat still, the silence stretching. Then, slowly, he reached out and placed his rough hand over hers. His palm was warm, steady, anchoring her like a root in the storm. Then it'll be ours now, he said. The words landed heavy, heavier than any bullet. But soft, too, like a prayer whispered in a church no one else remembered. Tears slipped down Eliza's cheeks. She clutched his hand tight, as though it were the first solid thing she had ever been given. In the days that followed, the ranch became a place of healing. Jacob, though wounded, taught Eliza how to mend fences, how to feed the animals, how to draw water from the well without spilling a drop. She, in turn, tended his shoulder, changed the bandages, stirred the pots on the stove. At night, they sat on the porch beneath the wide western sky, stars stretching endless above them. Sometimes they spoke of the past, his wife, her father, the cruelty that had shaped them. Sometimes they spoke of nothing at all, letting the silence carry what words couldn't. And slowly, the silence began to change. It was no longer the silence of grief, but of something new being built. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Eliza turned to Jacob. Her voice was stronger now, no longer the whisper of a ghost. Do you think the land ever forgives us? Jacob considered, chewing on the thought like a man chews on tough jerky. Then he said, Land don't know how to forgive, but people do. And sometimes, forgiving yourself is the hardest part. Eliza looked down, her hands resting on the swell of her belly. For the first time, she didn't flinch at it. Instead, she breathed deep and let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the child inside her was not only a shadow, maybe it was a beginning. Jacob watched her, the lines of his face softening in the fading light. He had lost much, but here beside him sat proof that loss wasn't the only story the West could write. Weeks passed. Life on the frontier remained hard. Dust storms, coyotes, the endless work of keeping a ranch alive. But now, each hardship was faced together. Jacob no longer walked into an empty house at the end of the day. Eliza no longer woke to nothing but silence and despair. One morning, as they worked side by side fixing a fence, Eliza paused, leaning on the post. She looked at Jacob, sweat streaking his brow, rifle always within reach, eyes scanning the horizon as though daring trouble to return. And she smiled, a real smile, the kind she hadn't thought she was capable of anymore. Jacob caught it, and though his own lips barely shifted beneath the beard, his eyes warmed. In that moment, both of them knew. Whatever the West threw at them next, they would face it not as broken pieces, but as something whole. The West was never kind. It never promised safety. But sometimes, in its harshest corners, it gave back something better than safety. It gave back the chance to stand, to love, to choose. And so Jacob Miller, a man hollowed by grief, and Eliza, a girl once left for dead, chose to walk forward together. Not because the world made it easy, but because the world had tried so hard to stop them. And that, more than any gunfight, was what made them strong.